The room was packed, the cameras flashed, and yet something was already wrong. No one could hear it yet, but the air was heavy, tense, as if the festival itself was holding its breath. Imagine walking onto a stage, the culmination of years of effort, only to be met with a silence so palpable it almost felt like a physical weight pressing down on your shoulders. That's exactly where Meghan Markle found herself at the 2026 Sundance Film Festival. All eyes were on her, every lens pointed in her direction, the world waiting, but no one clapped. Not a single sound of encouragement, just an eerie, unsettling silence that stretched out across the room like a slow-moving storm. But, before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Sundance had billed her appearance as a major highlight. The buzz had been building for months. Hollywood insiders had whispered excitedly about her documentary premiere, and fans had flooded social media with expectations. But as Meghan adjusted the microphone, glanced nervously at the crowd, and took a deep breath, it became painfully clear that this night was about to unfold very differently than anyone anticipated. What exactly went wrong? Was it the audience? Was it something Meghan had said in private? Or some invisible tension bubbling under the surface? Or was there something even more deliberate behind this silence? A power play, a hidden rivalry, a message sent without words. The answers, as we will uncover over the next hour, reveal a web of intrigue, betrayal, and shocking Hollywood politics that the public rarely gets to see. The moments leading up to the speech were charged with quiet drama. Backstage, assistants scurried nervously, whispering in urgent tones. The festival's organizers fidgeted with last-minute details, trying to adjust lights, check sound levels, and manage an audience that was increasingly restless. There were subtle glances exchanged between celebrities, some curious, some calculating, and some downright dismissive. It was a room teeming with unspoken tension, a delicate mix of excitement and unease. And then there was Meghan herself. To the outside world, she appeared composed, elegant, but up close, every slight movement told a story of apprehension. A hand gripping the podium, a slight furrow of the brow, eyes scanning the audience as if seeking reassurance. You could almost feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Every whispered comment, every click of a camera shutter added to the invisible tension in the room. Every second counted, and every second carried the potential for catastrophe. But why does this matter now? Why is this moment, this silence, so important? Sundance 2026 wasn't just another festival. It was a cultural touchstone, a gathering of the most influential voices in film, media, and entertainment. When a figure as prominent as Meghan Markle is ignored, dismissed, or left hanging in silence, it sends ripples far beyond the walls of the theater. It's a statement, a subtle but undeniable shift in perception. And in Hollywood, perception is everything. Social media had been buzzing for days beforehand. Leaks, speculation, and insider tips had already created a pressure cooker environment. Industry figures debated the implications, gossip circulated like wildfire, and fans, both loyal and critical, waited for the inevitable viral moment. No one could have predicted, however, just how extreme the response would be. The room's silence, the lack of applause, was only the beginning of a narrative that would explode across every platform within hours. Yet the audience's reaction was only half the story. Backstage, tensions ran deeper than anyone could see. Festival organizers exchanged frantic glances, trying to navigate unseen rivalries and long-standing grudges that simmered beneath the polished surface of Sundance's glitzy exterior. Some whispered about old disputes between celebrities, others muttered about carefully cultivated alliances that were now being tested in real time. The politics of the event were subtle, yet unmistakable, like currents under a calm sea, powerful enough to shift the trajectory of careers. The juxtaposition was stark. On one hand, the glamour and expectation, lights, cameras, red carpets, and media hype. On the other, the cold, calculated forces at work behind the scenes, silent disapproval, deliberate positioning, and a sense of calculated disregard from those who had the power to shape perception. The stage was not just a stage, it was a battlefield. And Meghan, despite her experience, was walking straight into it. As she stepped toward the microphone, the audience was already reacting, not in the obvious ways one might expect, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that hinted at deeper currents. Eyes shifted, murmurs rippled across the crowd, and small gestures carried enormous weight. There were fans in the front rows, eager to cheer, but even they seemed hesitant, unsure how to act. And the cameras captured every micro-expression, every twitch, every silent pause that compounded the tension. The room's energy was fragile, electric, and unpredictable. You might wonder, was this really about Meghan, or was it about the power dynamics at play in Hollywood? Was the silence genuine, or was it orchestrated, a quiet rebellion against someone who had become too big, too visible, too influential? In the world of entertainment, gestures, even inaction, can speak louder than words. And in this case, the absence of applause said volumes. The build-up to her speech had been meticulously choreographed. But real life, as it often does, refused to adhere to the script. Every expectation, every plan, every careful calculation was about to unravel in front of millions of viewers, both in the theater and across the globe via live broadcasts and viral clips. The stage was set, but the outcome was anyone's guess. And when the first few seconds of silence hit, it became clear that this was not merely an awkward moment, it was something far more consequential. Consider the psychological impact of this silence. To be in the spotlight and to feel ignored is profoundly disorienting. Humans are wired to respond to feedback, to affirmation. When that is withheld, it challenges your confidence, your perception, your entire sense of reality in that moment. Meghan's experience, captured in the glare of stage lights and the scrutiny of the cameras, would become a case study in public perception and the often cruel calculus of fame. And yet, there was a strange irony in the situation. A figure who had navigated intense scrutiny, relentless media coverage, and global fame now faced a form of rejection that was silent, subtle, and profoundly public. No scandal, no accusation, no dramatic confrontation. Just absence. And in that absence, the room spoke volumes louder than any voice could. It was a silence that demanded attention, that forced reflection, and that would ripple through the entertainment industry in ways few could have imagined. Even as the minutes ticked by, backstage staff and organizers were scrambling to maintain composure. Producers whispered to each other. Assistants ran notes back and forth, and security discreetly scanned the audience for any unexpected disruptions. But no physical disturbance could explain the silence that had settled over the room. This was a silence born of intent, of subtle coordination, and of an undercurrent of emotion that was entirely invisible to those watching from the outside. And yet, it would soon become impossible to ignore. By the time Meghan opened her mouth to speak, the weight of anticipation, expectation, and unseen dynamics collided. Every word she had prepared, every anecdote she had planned to share, now existed within a vacuum of response. And in that vacuum, the tension was almost unbearable. Cameras focused, flashes erupted, and the audience waited, but not to applaud. Instead, they waited to see what would happen next, their silence forming an invisible wall between performer and spectator. And as the moment stretched on, the whispers, glances, and subtle gestures converged to create an atmosphere thick with suspense. Every eye in the room, whether filled with admiration, curiosity, or resentment, contributed to a tension that was almost tangible. And the more Meghan spoke, the more that silence became a statement, a judgment, a commentary on influence, perception, and the unpredictable theater of human behavior. But what made this night truly remarkable was not just the silence, the tension. It was the revelation that this silence was only the beginning. Behind it, beyond it, lay a series of events, interactions, and secrets that would emerge in the following hours and days. Footage leaked online, staff confessions, celebrity reactions that would expose a hidden world of Hollywood maneuvering, strategic alliances, and subtle sabotage. And what came next would change everything about how the public viewed this moment. And so, as Meghan stood at the microphone, the lights shining down, the audience watching with a mixture of curiosity and calculated detachment, one question loomed larger than any other. How would she respond? Would she falter under the weight of silence, or would she find a way to command attention despite it? And perhaps most importantly, why did no one clap? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would it feel like to step onto one of the most prestigious stages in Hollywood, only to sense the world already judging you before you speak a single word? That's exactly the scenario that unfolded at the 2026 Sundance Film Festival, and Meghan Markle was at the center of it. The energy outside the theater was electric, a mix of anticipation, excitement, and the faint hum of tension that only high-profile events can generate. Fans had gathered for hours, media crews were jockeying for the perfect shot, and inside, the festival organizers were already sweating the smallest details. Every aspect of Meghan's arrival had been carefully planned. But in Hollywood, planning is never enough. The first images of her arrival circulated within minutes. A sleek black SUV rolling up to the festival's main entrance, paparazzi cameras flashing like a storm of fireflies. Meghan stepped out, dressed in a tailored ensemble that combined elegance with understated sophistication, projecting confidence in every step. On the surface, it was the picture-perfect entrance the media had been promised. But as her heels clicked against the pavement, there were subtle signals that something was already off. Security whispered into earpieces, festival staff exchanged uneasy glances, and a few veteran attendees tilted their heads in curiosity. Not admiration, but calculation. Behind the red carpet, smiles the undercurrents were more complex. The Sundance Festival, while celebrated for independent films and creative expression, is also a high-stakes networking arena. Hollywood's invisible hierarchies operate with precision. Meghan's presence was a lightning rod, and everyone in that ecosystem understood it. Some were genuinely supportive, eager to see her succeed and celebrate her work. Others, however, viewed her arrival as a disruption, a spotlight that competed with their own. And in the subtle games of influence and attention, even a celebrity of her caliber could feel the push and pull of unseen forces. Her entourage moved with disciplined efficiency, but the tension was palpable. Assistants checked schedules, producers adjusted lighting cues, and makeup artists made last-minute touch-ups. There were whispered reminders about timing, camera angles, and audience placement. The logistics alone could have overwhelmed anyone, but for Meghan, the stakes were higher. Every step she took toward the festival entrance wasn't just about grace or poise. It was a negotiation with perception itself. How she appeared, how she smiled, how she carried herself, every micro-expression would be scrutinized, dissected, and ultimately interpreted by thousands, both inside the room and online. And then came the crowd. Fans and festival-goers were packed shoulder to shoulder along the barricades, their excitement palpable, phones raised, eager to capture every frame. But even amid the cheers, there were undercurrents of judgment. Some faces were openly skeptical, some curious, and others seemed coldly indifferent. For someone like Meghan, accustomed to international attention and acclaim, this mix of reactions should have been routine. Yet there was something different about this crowd, a subtle collective tension, almost like they were waiting for something to go wrong. As she moved down the red carpet, cameras followed relentlessly. Every smile, every nod, every wave was magnified. Social media feeds began to fill with live reactions, tweets analyzing her outfit, Instagram posts speculating about her demeanor, and TikToks already going viral. The anticipation was no longer confined to the festival. It was global, instantaneous, and relentless. Every observer, whether celebrity, journalist, or fan, had a stake in what was about to unfold. And unbeknownst to Meghan, the audience's reactions would soon become a central narrative in a story far more complex than any public relations team could manage. Inside the theater, the tension was thick. Staff members moved like dancers rehearsing an invisible choreography, preparing for the sequence of events that would lead up to her speech. Lights were tested, audio equipment adjusted, seats arranged with precision. Every camera angle, every microphone placement, every potential sightline had been considered. And yet, for all the meticulous planning, there was an unpredictable variable: human behavior. Audiences, even at elite festivals, are not programmable. They react, they judge, they whisper, and sometimes they choose silence. As Meghan prepared to enter the theater, backstage whispers painted a picture that few outside the inner circle would ever hear. Some staff speculated about rivalries between prominent festival guests, noting subtle historical tensions that could influence reactions. Others mentioned that a few high-profile celebrities had made quiet, almost imperceptible gestures indicating disapproval, signaling that her presence might be contested on a social level, if not outright ignored. It wasn't malicious in a cinematic sense. There was no overt confrontation, but the subtleties of elite social signaling were unmistakable. This is Hollywood at its most intricate, where every glance, every whisper, every adjustment can carry meaning far beyond what is obvious. And Meghan, stepping into this charged environment, had no way of knowing the extent to which these silent dynamics would dictate the unfolding of her moment on stage. She was navigating a labyrinth of perception, expectation, and unspoken rules that few outsiders ever witness, and even fewer understand. Her first steps into the theater were met with polite applause, yet the applause lacked warmth. It was perfunctory, a nod to protocol rather than genuine engagement. As she made her way down the aisle, she could feel the room's attention. But it was a heavy attention, not light or celebratory. People watched, but their focus carried weight. Every head turned toward her, every eye fixed on her movements, was measuring, evaluating, and judging. The tension was both palpable and invisible, a contradiction that defined the room's energy. Once at the front, Meghan paused briefly, giving herself a moment to absorb the environment. Flashbulbs popped relentlessly. Celebrities in the front rows exchanged subtle signals, raised eyebrows, whispered comments, sideways glances. Every gesture, every micro-expression contributed to an atmosphere that was at once electric and foreboding. The narrative that would later dominate headlines was already being written, not in words, but in these small, telling movements. It's worth pausing to consider the psychology of these moments. Audiences, especially those composed of industry insiders and media elites, communicate in a language of silence as much as speech. A pause, a withheld clap, a glance, each can convey judgment, indifference, or disapproval. Meghan's challenge was to navigate not only her prepared speech, but the unspoken codes of behavior that govern the room. Success or failure here would not be measured merely in applause or engagement, but in the subtle readings of those around her. By the time she reached the stage, Meghan had transformed every ounce of anticipation, anxiety, and expectation into a poised, outwardly confident presence. She smiled, waved briefly, and adjusted her notes on the podium. But the energy of the room resisted her attempts to command it. There was a collective holding of breath, a tension that suggested everyone was waiting, not for her words, but for a signal of validation from others. It was a social experiment in real time, with Hollywood as both observer and participant. And yet, for all the calculated choreography of her arrival, all the rehearsed steps and perfected gestures, there was an undeniable uncertainty. The audience's mood was unpredictable, influenced by unseen alliances, personal histories, and subtle power dynamics that only those immersed in the industry could fully appreciate. For Meghan, this unpredictability was a test of her presence, her resilience, and her ability to hold the stage despite forces beyond her control. As she prepared to speak, the silence began to thicken. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of judgment, of distance, of subtle exclusion. And in that moment, the world outside, the cameras, the fans, the social media feeds, was about to witness an event that would become both viral sensation and cultural talking point. Every step she had taken to this point, every moment of preparation, led to a stage set not just for a speech, but for a confrontation of perception versus expectation, presence versus reception, an image versus reality. The moment was here. The lights shone, the audience leaned in, and Meghan took a final breath, unaware that what was about to unfold would become one of the most talked about incidents of Sundance 2026. It wasn't just a speech, it was a test of influence, a measurement of perception, and a lesson in the unpredictable power of human behavior. And as she raised the microphone, ready to begin, the audience's silence became an active participant in the unfolding drama. But what Meghan didn't yet realize was that the reaction, or lack thereof, was only the opening act. The real story, the deeper drama, and the shocking revelations that would follow were lurking just beyond the stage, ready to surface in ways no one could have predicted. What came next would not only define the night, but it would also send ripples across Hollywood and social media, creating a spectacle that everyone would talk about for weeks, and many would never forget. And just like that, the moment that would define Sundance 2026 and the silence that everyone would remember was about to begin. Even before the cameras rolled, even before the red carpet flashed, and the crowd murmured in anticipation, the tension backstage at Sundance 2026 was already thick enough to cut with a knife. Most festival goers never see this side of the events, the endless hours of coordination, the whispered instructions, the barely concealed frustration. And yet, for Meghan Markle, it was here, behind the velvet curtains and under the harsh fluorescent lights of the preparation rooms, that the first cracks in the evening's veneer began to appear. Rehearsals for her speech had started early that morning. The staff had painstakingly mapped out every step: when she would enter, where she would stand, how long the camera should linger on her, even the precise angle at which the lights should hit her face. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it was chaotic. Microphones refused to cooperate, lights flickered, and stagehands scurried across the room, muttering under their breath. There were moments when even the most seasoned assistants looked as though they might collapse from sheer stress. Meghan, as poised as ever in public, could feel it. She had rehearsed her lines countless times, but no amount of practice could prepare her for the undercurrent of unease radiating from every corner of the stage. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the room itself was conspiring to test her patience. One assistant muttered, almost apologetically, that the sound system had been finicky all morning, that feedback might cut in at any moment. Another whispered that a few key VIPs had arrived earlier than expected, and their moods were unpredictable. Every piece of information was another weight on her already tense shoulders. What Meghan faced was not just technical challenges, it was psychological warfare of the quietest kind. Backstage, there were subtle power plays at work, rivalries that no camera would ever catch. Producers argued quietly about camera angles, while assistants debated which celebrities should be seated closest to the stage. There were murmurs about past grievances, subtle digs aimed at anyone who dared to look too confident, too prepared. In Hollywood, these small moments can carry enormous significance, and Meghan was navigating a minefield of invisible social rules. Even the timing of her rehearsal was a delicate negotiation. The main hall was shared with other festival events, meaning that staff had to shuttle back and forth, resetting lighting and sound equipment between rehearsals. Each interruption created a ripple of frustration, not just among the staff but among other celebrities rehearsing for their own appearances. In this ecosystem, minor delays could quickly escalate into full-blown conflicts. Meghan felt the strain, but her expression remained calm, polished, as though nothing could touch her. To the world, she projected ease. Behind the scenes, every nerve was on edge. One particularly tense moment occurred when the microphone failed mid-rehearsal. The speaker system emitted a sharp squeal, and staff scrambled to adjust knobs and replace equipment. Meghan, already aware of the high stakes, paused mid-sentence, her calm smile never faltering even as panic rippled around her. "We'll just start over," she said, her voice steady, masking the adrenaline spike coursing through her. But in those brief seconds, the room's energy shifted. Staff members exchanged knowing glances, some subtly rolling their eyes at what they considered a minor disruption. Others, however, viewed it as a sign that the evening might spiral further. Beyond technical difficulties, the social dynamics were equally fraught. A few celebrities present at rehearsals made offhand comments, some innocent, others less so. One whispered that she had arrived fashionably late, implying critique of her timing. Another casually remarked on the placement of her notes, almost mocking the meticulous preparation she had invested. Each comment, no matter how subtle, added layers to the already charged atmosphere. Meghan, skilled at reading people, sensed the currents of judgment and envy swirling around her. She had learned to navigate media scrutiny, but these backstage whispers were different. They were direct, personal, and quietly judgmental. Meanwhile, festival organizers worked overtime to maintain a facade of control. Schedules were double-checked, seating arrangements reconsidered, and staff walked a fine line between efficiency and chaos management. Every minor disruption was addressed with rapid-fire instructions, and yet, it was impossible to contain the invisible tension. The rehearsal space became a crucible, a test of endurance not just for Meghan, but for everyone involved. Each interruption, each whispered comment, each tiny technical glitch seemed magnified, as if the universe itself was conspiring to test her resolve. Humor, in small doses, was used as a coping mechanism. At one point, an assistant made a sarcastic comment about the microphone being possessed, eliciting quiet, nervous laughter. It was a brief release, a momentary relief from the tension, but it underscored just how high-strung the environment had become. Humor here wasn't just comedy, it was survival, a way for people to navigate a room filled with invisible pressure points. Meghan, ever aware of her surroundings, registered the joke but kept her focus, refusing to let even a hint of levity disrupt her concentration. What was particularly striking about these rehearsals was the contrast between public expectation and private reality. While outside the theater, fans were speculating about glamour, red carpets, and poised speeches, backstage was a battlefield of nerves, ego, and unspoken competition. Every participant, from celebrity to assistant, was playing a dual role, maintaining a public image while negotiating an invisible hierarchy. Meghan's challenge was to thrive in both simultaneously. Every step, every glance, every minor adjustment would be noticed, interpreted, and potentially weaponized in ways she could not control. Despite the tension, Meghan displayed remarkable composure. She adjusted her notes, practiced intonation, and walked through gestures with precision. Her body language projected confidence even as the room pulsed with uncertainty, but it was impossible to ignore the subtle frictions. Staff whispered about potential audience reactions, peers made offhand criticisms, and the technical difficulties continued in sporadic bursts. In that environment, even the most seasoned public figure could feel unsteady. Yet Meghan's outward calm provided a stabilizing force for those around her, even as she internally calculated every move. The rehearsal's climax came when she walked to the stage for a full run-through. The lights blazed, the microphones hummed, and staff held their breath as she simulated the delivery of her speech. Each word, each pause, each gesture was scrutinized, and yet, despite her polished performance, there was an undeniable undercurrent. An audience that, in theory, was waiting to cheer, but whose approval was uncertain, contingent, and unpredictable. The room felt suspended in time, a delicate balance between expectation and unpredictability, with Meghan at its center. And then came the subtle moments that would later be dissected in viral clips. A whisper exchanged between two high-profile guests, a slight shift in a seated journalist's posture, a barely perceptible frown from a VIP in the front row. None of it overt, none of it explicit, but each gesture added weight to the invisible tension in the room. These were the moments that Hollywood thrives on, the unspoken, the ambiguous, the subtly powerful. Meghan's challenge was to rise above it, to command attention despite forces that she could neither predicted nor control. As rehearsals concluded, the overarching narrative was clear. The evening would not unfold in a straightforward, predictable way. Every technical glitch, every whispered judgment, every subtle gesture backstage had set the stage for a moment charged with suspense and uncertainty. The audience's eventual reaction, or silence, was already being written, not in applause, but in these invisible forces. And as Meghan left the rehearsal space to prepare for her public appearance, she could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down, a mixture of excitement, nerves, and the unmistakable sense that what was about to happen would not be ordinary. And as the curtain closed on rehearsals, one question hung in the air. When the moment came, would the carefully rehearsed words resonate, or would the silent judgments of the audience overshadow everything? But what came next would change the tone of the night entirely, and no one, not even Meghan, saw it coming. What if I told you that the silence Meghan would face at Sundance wasn't just random, that it had been quietly brewing long before the cameras flashed, long before her heels clicked down the red carpet, long before anyone even heard her voice. Behind the glitz, the lights, and the cameras, the world of Hollywood thrives on whispered rivalries, subtle power plays, and carefully orchestrated social signaling. And at Sundance 2026, Meghan Markle unknowingly stepped straight into the eye of that storm. The moment she arrived, invisible currents began to shift. Celebrity networks are a complex ecosystem, governed by cliques, alliances, and old grudges. Every festival, every premiere, every public appearance carries its own hierarchy, and every player knows their place, or thinks they do. For Meghan, the rules were different. She wasn't just a guest, she was a cultural figure, a lightning rod for attention, and, in the eyes of some, a threat to the carefully balanced social order of Hollywood insiders. Some whispered about past perceived slights, others about professional jealousy, and a few about her unique ability to dominate media attention simply by existing. Backstage, the whispers began almost immediately. As she walked past tables where actors and producers were rehearsing lines or checking scripts, low murmurs traveled across the room. Not loud enough for her to hear, but audible enough to the trained ear. She thinks she owns the room, always stealing the spotlight. Do you think she knows how tense this is for everyone else? Every word was carefully measured, designed to pass under the radar, yet still carry a sting. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was powerful, and Meghan's presence had triggered it. Some of the most influential figures at Sundance had quietly resented her for years. Her fame, her ability to control narratives, and her knack for drawing attention had positioned her as both a cultural icon and a disruptor. These weren't superficial jealousies. They were professional, strategic, and emotionally charged. A few had even coordinated behind the scenes, ensuring that subtle signs of disapproval would ripple across the room. A raised eyebrow here, a whispered comment there, a deliberate placement in the audience to suggest distance or detachment. It wasn't about rudeness. It was about signaling power and influence in the most elegant, invisible way possible. The whispers weren't all malicious. Some were curious, speculative, or even admiring. "She handles this like a pro," one assistant muttered, clearly impressed. "But do you see how everyone's eyes are on her? Even those who don't like her can't stop watching." It was a dual-edged sword, admiration and envy intertwined in a delicate, often contradictory dance. And for Meghan, it meant that every movement, every glance, every subtle inflection of tone would be interpreted, evaluated, and, in some cases, weaponized. Even the seating arrangements backstage were a battlefield. VIPs positioned themselves strategically, some in rows designed to be highly visible on camera, others just out of frame. Those closer to the stage could control narratives, while those further back could judge from a position of detachment. Every placement, every choice of posture, every side-eye glance carried meaning. And unbeknownst to Meghan, these silent judgments were accumulating, forming a collective weight that would later manifest as the infamous silence when she finally spoke. One particularly revealing moment occurred during a pre-event gathering in the green room. Meghan had arrived to mingle briefly, exchanging polite hellos and small talk with other attendees, but she immediately sensed subtle distancing. A few actors she had worked with in the past gave brief nods but avoided sustained eye contact. Others, previously friendly, now seemed tense, their smiles polite but strained. It was a masterclass in microdynamics, the kind of unspoken communication that tells you more about intent than words ever could. And then there were the insiders, those who thrived on gossip, leverage, and reputation management. They watched Meghan carefully, noting her posture, her tone, her interactions. Small shifts in behavior became ammunition for speculation. She hesitated before speaking. She adjusted her notes twice. Look at how she surveys the room, clearly calculating. In Hollywood, even these minor observations can be weaponized, amplified through rumor networks, and eventually magnified on social media. The whispers weren't just limited to verbal commentary. There were subtle social maneuvers as well. Seating at tables, prearranged camera angles, and even who was allowed in certain backstage spaces were all forms of soft power. A festival veteran observed, almost as an aside, "You can't just look at the red carpet or the audience. Watch the room behind the curtain. That's where the real politics happen." And Meghan was walking straight into it. Interestingly, some of the whispers contained kernels of admiration, even awe. "She's calm under pressure," one production assistant murmured. "You'd never guess how high the stakes are for her." But admiration in Hollywood is rarely mutual. It often comes with envy, skepticism, and a silent competition over who deserves attention, influence, or validation. And Meghan, no matter how polished, was an outsider to some of these long-standing social hierarchies. Her presence was a disruptor, and disruption in this world is rarely welcomed quietly. The media presence intensified the backstage dynamics. Photographers and journalists hovered at the edges, taking notes, capturing moments, and analyzing every gesture. Their silent observation added an additional layer of scrutiny. Every whispered rivalry, every subtle signaling gesture was potentially viral fodder. In Hollywood, visibility is currency, and no one wanted to appear weak, complicit, or distracted while someone as high profile as Meghan was in the room. The stakes weren't just social. They were professional, career-defining, and immediate. By the time the rehearsals concluded, the atmosphere had evolved into something almost tangible, a mixture of anticipation, tension, and restrained hostility. Meghan's presence had catalyzed a complex web of reactions, some visible, some hidden, all significant. She had arrived prepared, poised, and professional, but the environment around her was charged with forces beyond her control. The whispers, the glances, the micro-expressions, they would all come into play when the spotlight finally landed on her. The irony, of course, is that many of those whispering and judging believed they were being subtle, discreet, or even clever. But in reality, these tiny gestures, hushed comments, and carefully measured distances were amplifying into a collective energy. They were signaling something larger than themselves, a shared, unspoken narrative about influence, recognition, and power. Meghan was about to discover that the theater, the audience, and the world beyond weren't the only forces shaping her night. And it wasn't just about rivalry for attention. Some of the whispers stemmed from deeper, more personal tensions, old disagreements, lingering resentment, or professional envy dating back years. In Hollywood, memory is long, and grudges are often quietly maintained until a moment presents itself to signal judgment, disapproval, or superiority. Meghan, entering this charged atmosphere, would face the consequences of these layered social currents in a way that was subtle yet devastating: the audience's silence. As the stage time approached, the whispers and rivalries coalesced into a quiet but powerful force. They shaped the room's energy, directed attention in subtle ways, and created a silent prelude to the moment that would later shock both those in attendance and the global audience. Every subtle cue, every polite yet distant gesture was building toward the climax of the evening. And while Meghan would step onto the stage with grace and confidence, she was unknowingly stepping into a performance that extended beyond the script, one orchestrated by human behavior, social hierarchies, and the invisible power of whispered rivalries. And just like that, backstage tension had set the stage for what would become one of the most memorable and dissected moments of Sundance 2026. The audience's response, or the lack thereof, was already seated in these whispered dynamics, and Meghan's experience on stage would soon reveal just how potent these invisible forces could be. But what happened next would not just challenge her composure, it would expose a network of subtle sabotage and social maneuvering that no one was fully prepared for. Have you ever walked into a room where the energy feels almost alive, humming with anticipation, judgment, and expectation all at once? That was the atmosphere inside the Sundance 2026 main theater as the audience began to file in for Meghan Markle's highly publicized speech. It wasn't the normal buzz of excitement you might expect at a film festival. There was an undertone, a subtle, almost imperceptible tension that made the air feel heavier with each passing second. From the moment guests crossed the threshold, the night was charged with silent calculations, unspoken hierarchies, and a collective curiosity that was about to erupt in ways no one anticipated. The audience was diverse, yet unified by a single, invisible code: Hollywood insider etiquette. Celebrities, producers, critics, journalists, and festival VIPs filled the seats, each carrying their own stakes and subtle agendas. They had come to see Meghan, yes, but they had also come to measure her, judge her, and, for some, challenge her. Their energy wasn't malicious, exactly. It was strategic. Every whisper, every glance, every polite nod or hesitation was loaded with significance, a silent language only the seasoned observers could decode. As they entered the theater, body language began to tell its own story. Some attendees leaned forward, eager to catch every detail, scanning the stage for cues. Others slouched subtly, folding arms or crossing legs, signaling skepticism or detachment. Even seated close to the front, those who should have seemed most engaged occasionally exchanged sideways glances, whispered quietly, or adjusted their expressions in ways meant to subtly convey their opinions. Every micro-movement became a form of commentary. It was the kind of silent signaling that can determine the tone of a room, the kind of nuance that Meghan would feel immediately, even if she couldn't yet identify its origin. The contrast between expectation and reality was striking. Outside, the world imagined a room brimming with cheers, applause, and admiration. Inside, the energy was fragile, almost volatile. Some fans clapped politely as they entered, their excitement tempered by a collective awareness of the festival's elite atmosphere. Journalists snapped photos, but their expressions betrayed scrutiny, not celebration. And the celebrities, the ones with decades of experience and high-stakes public appearances, were the most fascinating. They observed with clinical precision, watching reactions, noting every detail, and quietly calculating how this moment might affect reputation, alliances, and influence. Even small details contributed to the unease. The placement of chairs, the angle of the lights, the timing of camera adjustments, all had been meticulously planned, but nothing could fully account for human behavior. Audiences are unpredictable, and even in the most controlled environments, reactions can shift in an instant. A single cough, a whispered comment, or a delayed applause can send ripples across the room, altering the mood and subtly influencing perception. For Meghan, stepping into this environment meant navigating a labyrinth of energy, intent, and invisible social cues that were far more complex than the simple act of giving a speech. Some of the unease was fueled by prior knowledge. Many in the audience were aware of her presence not just as a celebrity, but as a cultural figure whose every move was scrutinized by both the media and her peers. Rumors had circulated in the days leading up to the event, whispered critiques, previous disagreements, and subtle rivalries. All of these factors coalesced into a room that was both observant and evaluative. Every glance, every subtle shift in posture was a silent message to Meghan and to the rest of the world watching. The journalists and photographers added another layer of intensity. They moved like predators, positioning themselves strategically to capture the perfect angle. Every camera lens framed her in ways that emphasized poise, vulnerability, or tension, sometimes all at once. Their presence was not neutral. It was an invisible force shaping both perception and reality. Meghan would later reflect on how this pressure felt as she stepped onto the stage. An acute awareness that she was being watched, not only by the people physically present, but by the entire world through these lenses. Humor, surprisingly, played a role even in this tension-filled room. A few assistants and low-level staffers shared subtle jokes under their breath, brief and almost imperceptible, to relieve the strain. Looks like everyone here took a crash course in silent judgment. One whispered to another, earning a nervous chuckle. It was a coping mechanism, a tiny release valve in a room where the pressure could have become overwhelming. But even humor carried a tinge of irony, highlighting how seriously this room, with all its glitz and glamour, was taking its own social theater. The hierarchy in the room became more apparent as seating finalized. Longtime festival veterans chose seats that allowed them to observe without being observed, while newcomers or younger actors were often strategically positioned, where their reactions would be visible on camera. Even audience members who were not celebrities seemed to sense the rules. They leaned forward when appropriate, murmured softly to each other, and nodded politely at the correct moments. Every movement, no matter how slight, contributed to the delicate balance of control and perception. For Meghan, entering this room meant stepping into a theater that was a living organism, its energy shaped by every individual's expectations, biases, and judgments. She could feel it, even without analyzing it consciously, A subtle tension, a quiet buzz of anticipation, mixed with skepticism, like static electricity in the air. It was the kind of environment where even the most composed speaker could feel exposed, tested, and scrutinized. Every gesture mattered. Every word would be dissected, and every pause had the potential to shift the audience's collective perception. The stage itself loomed as both opportunity and challenge. Lights, cameras, and microphones were perfectly arranged, yet they could not control the audience's reaction. That energy was organic, unpredictable, and charged with both curiosity and judgment. The room, as Meghan would later realize, was a character in its own right, responsive, reactive, and capable of influencing outcomes in subtle but profound ways. As the minutes ticked by, the audience's unease began to ripple outward. Journalists exchanged quiet notes, celebrities shifted in their seats, and subtle murmurs traveled through the room. None of it was overtly hostile, but the effect was undeniable. The collective energy of the room was tense, anticipatory, and charged with an almost electric sense of waiting. And that waiting, that collective suspension, would set the stage for the moment that would shock everyone. The moment when Meghan finally took the microphone. And just like that, the unease in the audience wasn't a background detail anymore. It was a force that would actively shape the night, influence perception, and transform a highly anticipated speech into a viral, dissected moment in Hollywood history. What seemed like polite tension in the seats would soon become a defining feature of the evening, a silent, invisible participant in a drama far larger than anyone had anticipated. But what happened next, the first seconds of her speech, would turn that unease into something unforgettable, and no one in the room was fully prepared for it. What would it feel like to walk to the center of a room filled with the most influential people in the entertainment world, knowing every eye is on you, but sensing almost immediately that their attention is not entirely yours to command? That's exactly the moment Meghan Markle stepped into at the 2026 Sundance Film Festival. The red carpet was behind her, the rehearsals complete, the audience in place, and the cameras all aimed at one point. And yet, the energy in the room was unlike anything she had experienced before. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't applause either. It was something subtler, more disorienting, and infinitely more powerful. A calculated, almost tangible silence. She approached the microphone, poised, elegant, a slight smile playing on her lips, masking the tension that had been building all day. Her heels clicked deliberately on the polished wood stage, each step echoing faintly, emphasizing the gravity of the moment. The cameras focused, flashes popping in rapid succession, and the audience shifted in their seats. But instead of leaning in with excitement or cheering at her arrival, there was a collective stillness, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Every eye in that theater was on her, but the energy she expected, support, warmth, engagement, was conspicuously absent. It's difficult to convey just how disorienting this can feel. Imagine preparing for a performance your entire life, rehearsing every line, every gesture, every inflection, only to find that the room refuses to play along. There were no loud whispers of disapproval, no overt snickers, but the silence carried a weight that was almost suffocating. It was a silence filled with judgment, curiosity, and, for some, subtle disdain. It was a social test disguised as a premiere speech, and Meghan had walked directly into it. As she adjusted the microphone, several things happened, almost simultaneously. Staff backstage held their collective breath, whispering last-minute instructions into headsets. Photographers jockeyed for position, capturing angles that emphasized vulnerability or poise, depending on the lens. And the audience, VIPs, critics, celebrities, and insiders, watched intently, their faces a careful mix of neutrality, curiosity, and barely concealed skepticism. It was an intricate dance of perception, with Meghan unknowingly caught at the center of the choreography. For the first few seconds, Meghan paused, scanning the audience, gathering her composure. She cleared her throat softly, a small exhale of nervous energy that she tried to channel into control. The stage lights reflected off her notes, creating a shimmering effect, almost as if the room itself were amplifying the tension. And in that pause, something remarkable occurred. the silence became almost audible. Every micro-reaction of the audience, the slight lean back in a chair, the crossing of arms, the quick glance at a neighbor, was amplified. Every small gesture, almost imperceptible individually, combined into a collective force that shaped the room's atmosphere. She began to speak, her voice calm, measured, and practiced. The words she had written, rehearsed countless times, flowed smoothly. But the audience's reaction, or lack thereof, quickly became a character in the unfolding drama. No nods of encouragement, no gentle murmurs of agreement, not a single applause. It wasn't rudeness, exactly. It was something subtler, more calculated. A collective withholding, a refusal to validate her presence in the way she had likely anticipated. And then came the moments that would later go viral. A few people glancing at their phones mid-sentence, others quietly whispering to neighbors, some with raised eyebrows that betrayed curiosity or judgment. The combination of body language, subtle gestures, and quiet murmurs painted a picture of an audience that was present but emotionally disengaged, a striking contrast to the energy of most festival events. Meghan's speech, meant to be a highlight, had become a study in silent disapproval and subtle social dynamics. Backstage, the tension mirrored what was happening on stage. Staff and producers watched monitors, their expressions a mixture of concern and disbelief. Some whispered, questioning whether the audience's behavior was deliberate. Others speculated about rivalries, old grudges, or subtle power plays that might be influencing reactions. Even seasoned veterans of Hollywood premieres admitted that the silence was unprecedented in its intensity and coordination, and that it carried a weight far beyond mere audience reaction. Meghan's reaction, subtle yet telling, was one of quiet composure. She continued her speech, maintaining a steady tone and polished delivery, even as the lack of engagement pressed down on her. Her confidence didn't waver outwardly, but each second of muted response added a layer of psychological strain. Humans, after all, are wired to seek validation, especially in public performance. When that validation is withheld, it creates an internal tension that can be both disorienting and profoundly revealing. And yet, for all the tension in the room, there were moments of complexity. A few attendees seated discreetly near the back leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing in curiosity or intrigue. Others whispered quietly, not out of malice, but out of genuine analysis, observing gestures, timing, and cadence. In this way, the audience became an intricate network of micro-reactions, a live social experiment in influence, perception, and the silent power of judgment. Every movement mattered, every glance carried significance, and Meghan, whether consciously or not, was navigating a room alive with invisible forces. The irony of the moment was striking. Here was a figure accustomed to global scrutiny, media attention, and high-pressure appearances, facing a challenge that no amount of preparation could fully address: the weight of collective silence. It wasn't a hostile audience, nor was it disengaged. They were both present and absent, participating and withholding simultaneously. It was a paradoxical reaction, one that amplified the psychological impact of the moment and created a tension that would later dominate headlines, social media, and public discussion. Shortly into her speech, a subtle ripple moved through the crowd. A faint cough here, a whispered exchange there, a slight shifting of posture, but nothing overt, nothing disruptive. And yet, these minor movements carried immense weight, each adding to the overall tone of deliberate disengagement. Meghan maintained her composure, adapting her pacing slightly, injecting subtle pauses to gauge reactions. Even though the audience remained largely inscrutable, it was a test of resilience, timing, and poise, and she was holding her ground against an invisible, yet powerful current. The contrast was undeniable: a meticulously rehearsed speech delivered by a poised public figure, and an audience that refused to fully participate. Every word, every pause, every gesture was magnified by the absence of applause, the lack of visible engagement. The silence itself became a character, interacting with her performance, challenging her presence, and reshaping the narrative in real time. In that moment, it became clear that the theater's energy wasn't merely a backdrop. It was a force capable of shaping perception, influencing social hierarchies, and generating cultural shockwaves. By the time she reached the midpoint of her speech, the room's silence had evolved into a kind of tension-laden rhythm. It was almost hypnotic. Meghan spoke, the audience watched, minor reactions punctuated the stillness, and the cameras captured every moment for posterity. Backstage staff began exchanging uneasy glances, realizing that what was unfolding was not just an awkward performance. It was a rare, real-time demonstration of social dynamics, celebrity influence, and Hollywood's invisible hierarchies. And as Meghan continued, one subtle movement would seal the moment for history. A deliberate, almost imperceptible glance from a high-profile attendee in the front row, a mixture of evaluation, curiosity, and silent judgment, was caught perfectly on camera. That moment, while fleeting, became emblematic of the night, the tension, the quiet power plays, and the dissonance between preparation and reception. It was the kind of subtle gesture that would later be analyzed frame by frame, dissected in articles, social media posts, and late-night commentary. And just like that, Meghan's carefully rehearsed speech had become something entirely different. A live demonstration of the silent power of the audience. It wasn't just about words, or stage presence, or delivery. It was about how humans respond in the absence of validation, how subtle judgments ripple through a room, and how influence, perception, and authority interact in the most unexpected ways. The silence, almost imperceptible at first, had transformed into a defining force, shaping the narrative before a single word could fully land. But what came next? The audience's next move, the viral reaction, and the hidden whispers behind the cameras would transform this tense moment into a full-blown media phenomenon, one that no one in the theater or online was prepared for. What does it feel like when you speak to a room full of people and no one responds? Not a smile, not a nod, not even polite applause. That is precisely what happened the moment Meghan Markle's speech began at Sundance 2026, and it was a moment that would reverberate far beyond the theater walls. For anyone else, silence might have been awkward. For Meghan, it became a psychological test, a social indictment, and the beginning of a public spectacle that no one anticipated. The first words left her lips, precise and practiced, flowing from hours of preparation, yet the room remained eerily still. Not one hand clapped, not one murmured word of encouragement passed through the audience. Cameras captured the moment, freezing faces in what would later be called iconic silence by media outlets. Journalists, influencers, and industry insiders watched, some whispering quietly to neighbors, others pretending to adjust their notebooks or mobile devices, but all were consciously participating in a collective, almost imperceptible refusal to engage. Backstage, the reaction was immediate. Assistants and festival organizers exchanged nervous glances, whispering into their headsets. One producer muttered under their breath, "I've never seen anything like this." Technicians frantically checked monitors, unsure if the lack of applause was a technical miscue or a deliberate social statement. Every person in the theater, from front row VIPs to camera operators tucked in the corners, was aware that something unprecedented was unfolding. But no one could predict the full ramifications. The silence carried layers of meaning. For some, it was a sign of skepticism. For others, an invisible protest. In Hollywood, public gestures, or their absence, speak louder than any words could. The audience was telling Meghan, in a language that transcends applause, that her presence was contested, her influence measured, and her narrative scrutinized. Every pause, every quiet intake of breath, every subtle movement became a signal. And as Meghan continued speaking, she could sense it, feel it pressing against her performance, challenging her poise, even as she projected calm confidence. It's one thing to imagine a silent room, it's another to experience it, knowing that millions of eyes online and thousands more in the theater are recording your every gesture. The human brain instinctively seeks feedback. Applause, laughter, or even murmurs validate presence, performance, and credibility. With those cues absent, Meghan had to navigate uncharted territory. Every sentence she delivered felt heavier, every gesture magnified, every breath carrying the weight of collective evaluation. And yet, she pressed on, embodying the composure that had become her trademark. The audience, however, had its own dynamics. In the front rows, a few prominent actors exchanged subtle glances, shifting ever so slightly in their seats. Some held their hands loosely in laps, fingers tapping against notebooks in ways that seemed casual but communicated a quiet skepticism. In the back, journalists whispered to each other, debating the significance of the silence, recording reactions, and live posting their observations to social media platforms. Every individual action, no matter how discreet, contributed to the overall energy or lack thereof. In the room, it wasn't a lack of awareness. Every person there knew who she was, what she represented, and the implications of this moment. Some were curious, genuinely interested in the speech's content. Others were more strategic, observing her for potential missteps, recording subtle vulnerabilities, or simply gauging how she handled pressure. In Hollywood, perception is currency, and silence, especially coordinated, intentional silence, can be a powerful tool to convey judgment without overt confrontation. And yet, despite the silence, there were flashes of engagement. A photographer adjusted focus, a nearby assistant subtly nodded, a security detail discreetly leaned forward. These minor gestures were enough to remind Meghan that she was not entirely invisible, but they were too subtle to provide the kind of feedback most speakers rely on in high-stakes moments. The room became a study in contrasts, engagement and disengagement, observation and judgment, validation and denial, all occurring simultaneously. As the minutes ticked on, the psychological weight of silence grew. Every carefully rehearsed word she spoke seemed to hang in the air, unanswered, unacknowledged. For anyone else, it might have been demoralizing. For Meghan, it was a challenge to maintain focus, a test of resilience that demanded both grace and composure. She adjusted her pacing, allowed herself slight pauses, and injected subtle inflections to gauge any hint of reaction. But the silence remained consistent, almost oppressive. Backstage, the tension mirrored what was unfolding on stage. Festival organizers checked seating arrangements, whispered urgently into headsets, and communicated updates about timing. One assistant, overhearing murmurs in the control room, commented on how unprecedented the audience's behavior was. "I've never seen a reaction, or lack of reaction, like this. It's like the whole room is holding its breath, waiting for her to fail." And in a way, they were right. The silence was not neutral. It was an active, almost intentional force, testing Meghan's presence, her narrative, and her ability to command attention despite invisible opposition. The psychology of silence is fascinating. Humans instinctively respond to social feedback, and in the absence of expected reactions, the mind begins to question itself. Was she speaking too slowly? Too quickly? Were her gestures off? Was the audience judging her, or was it something else entirely? For Meghan, every word was under magnification, and the lack of feedback created a subtle, insidious pressure that few had the opportunity, or the skill, to withstand. Then there were the social dynamics layered within that silence. A whispered conversation between two VIPs in the front row, a slight smirk here, a furrowed brow there, tiny signals that would later be replayed and dissected in viral clips. The audience wasn't simply quiet, it was subtly, collectively communicating disapproval, distance, or detachment. Every gesture fed into an invisible narrative that extended far beyond the stage, influencing journalists, fans, and the broader cultural conversation. Despite all this, Meghan continued her speech with remarkable composure. Her words flowed, measured and precise, infused with the energy of someone who had rehearsed extensively.